Welcome to Leading Minds Revealed, the podcast that pulls back the curtain on how today's top leaders harness the power of mindfulness to conquer the fast-paced, ever-changing world of business. In each episode, we sit down with C-suite executives and leaders who share their strategies for navigating rapid change with skill and clarity. Join us as we uncover the transformative mindsets that drive extraordinary leadership. These insights aren't found in business books, and they'll revolutionize the way you lead. And now, here's your host, Michael Apollo.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Leading Minds Revealed. In this conversation, we'll explore what it takes to transform leadership from rules and hierarchy to empathy and human connection. In this episode, you'll learn how empathy and emotional intelligence can reshape cultures and inspire trust, what it means to lead through disruption in sectors where accountability is critical, and how personal experiences and mentors influence the way leaders show up today. My guest is the CEO and Registrar of Professional Engineers Ontario, the regulator for nearly 90,000 engineers across the province of Ontario, Canada. She's the first woman to hold this role in the organization's 100-plus year history, and she's been leading a cultural transformation to bring empathy, fairness, and humanity into a system not always known for it. With that, welcome my guest, Jennifer Quaglietta. Jennifer, welcome to the show. So lovely to have you here.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Well, my pleasure is all mine, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation. And I think something that really struck me in our conversation is this whole notion of really bringing in these qualities of kindness, empathy, fairness into a type of organization that is, you would think about it as very analytical, rules driven, which it needs to from a public safety standpoint. And I'm interested how all that meshes, but I'd like to start off like on an eagle's eye view and really explore something that you shared around how leaders can't succeed without empathy. And so, especially now, why do you feel that's important?
Empathy has always mattered in leadership, but in today's world, I don't think it's optional anymore. We're living in an era of constant disruption, whether it's technological, societal, and even environmental, where these forces are reshaping how people experience work and how they trust leadership. The pandemic, I think, accelerated a shift in expectations. People no longer want to work for organizations. They want to work with organizations that understand them. Their expectations of employers have dramatically changed. And I believe empathy is that bridge between accountability and humanity. It's what allows leaders to listen deeply. It allows us to connect authentically and perhaps even allows us to make decisions that balance performance with people's lived realities. For me, empathy isn't about being soft. It's about being strategically human. It means understanding what motivates your team, recognizing when burnout is creeping in, and having the courage to pause, to listen, to co create solutions rather than dictate them. It's applying, like you mentioned, that emotional intelligence and a new concept I just learned recently, conflict intelligence to every situation. It's about having faith that people mean the right thing and giving grace when we make mistakes so that we can learn quickly from them. When I became CEO and registrar here at PEO a few years ago, one of my first priorities was to reestablish trust, not just through policies and processes, but through presence and transparency. I started by creating forums for listening, things like coffee chats and reflection Fridays, where I would send out interesting articles or thought stories to help the organization get to know me better, but also to demonstrate how to be reflective. And that then moved to a concept called reflection roundtables, where I invited groups of teams to connect with me about our values or important topics to them that they wanted to share their insights. That eventually adapted again into something that we call connection corners, where we learn more about people's cultures, It also created joint work discussions where we talk about what matters most to staff and what pebbles they have in their shoes that need help being removed, or having open conversations about our culture and continuous daily improvement. And I think those moments of empathy didn't weaken our accountability. It strengthened it because people felt seen, they felt valued, and they helped. It helped making sure that they felt included in our journey of change together. If I can also add, I think that empathy really fuels innovation. When people feel safe to speak up, they take more risks, they share ideas, and they really start to challenge the norms. And I think that's how transformation has happened here over the last couple of years. Not through this sort of fear of failure, but really through that shared sense of purpose. And whether my time in healthcare or regulation or in engineering, I've learned that empathy is the most reliable technology we have for change management and adapting to our environment. It kind of creates that alignment between the head and the heart, between evidence and emotion. And so I guess the question is, why is it essential right now? And I think it's because we're navigating in a world where trust is so fragile and complexity is rising. And it is that empathy that grounds us in what's timeless, our shared humanity. And it is the foundation of resilient systems in learning organizations and in thriving cultures. And so I often tell my teams empathy, it's not a nice to have anymore. It's our most powerful competitive advantage.
I started chuckling a little bit there because I'm noticing more and more right now. There's this discussion around efficiency, and I think the AI narrative that's being created. I'm hypothesizing that it is largely created by a lot of these tech CEOs, really pushing this idea of human workforce disruption and how you can just automate so many things.
Right.
And one time I've heard in the past that it was a really great phrase where empathy, this emotional, social intelligence, this capacity to connect, create a sense of cohesion across your teams, establish that sense of safety is the soft wiring across an organization, the hard wiring being these core processes that we have to do. And you can't have one without the other.
Yeah.
And so, what would be your message then for leaders who are perhaps really being driven right now to think about that efficiency discussion, right? How do we cut costs, automate as much as possible? It feels like to me like almost like dehumanizing
Mm,
work a little bit, and focusing on changing the way that work is structured so that we can automate as much as possible and we can be as efficient as possible right now. How does empathy and a lot of these concepts of deep listening and connection, how do, what's their place in this emerging reality that's coming up?
yeah. Interesting. So the AI piece in particular here, we've gone really slow, and we are making a real strong effort to speak to the fact that AI is not here to replace us. It's here to act as our support agents in our work in creating those efficiencies. Look, I've had the privilege of working across very different sectors: government, hospital, insurance, and now regulation. And what's interesting is that while these environments and mandates are changing, at the end of the day, our human dynamics have not. And in every setting, empathy has been, for me at least, the difference between organizations that crumble under pressure and those that rise stronger from it. And you think about a time in government where I spent part of my career at the Ministry of Health. Empathy really reshaped how we approached policy transformation. I recall vividly during one time of the annual budgeting planning process where there was this sort of intense discussion around programs that might be renewed and transformed or sunset. And it was easy at that point to get lost in numbers and spreadsheets. But the most effective leaders in that room were the ones who brought the conversation back to people, to patients, to families, to clinicians, to communities. And it was in that instance where I think for me, empathy reminded us that behind every budget line was a life impacted. And that lens helped us find solutions that were both fiscally responsible, yet human centered. And you mentioned AI and efficiencies. AI doesn't have the capacity to apply that EI, that emotional intelligence to these types of scenarios. I can think of another example when I worked at North York General Hospital. Empathy was the cornerstone of how we led through disruption. Healthcare can be high stakes, as we know it, and very emotionally charged, especially during times of system strain. And it was during that time that I saw firsthand how empathic leadership really took flight. Taking time to understand very important topics like staff burnout, fear, pride, how those could transform conflict into collaboration. When people felt heard, we didn't just improve morale, we improved quality and the safety of outcomes. I also look at, I mentioned I worked for quite some time also in insurance. And my time at Hurock, empathy really shaped how we managed crisis with hospitals and providers across the country during the pandemic. In the world of risk and insurance, the instinct can be to protect liability. And I recall during COVID, the number one concern from the sector was, is our insurer going to cover us for communicable diseases like COVID? And with all the risk, the answer was absolutely yes, we're going to be here for you. And having empathy, I think, helped us shift the question from who's at fault here to what can we learn together? And it's that shift that builds trust and that trust that turns risk into resilience. In my current role here at PEO, again, empathy is how we're redefining what regulatory excellence looks like. For decades, regulators were seen as the enforcers, right? The distant, procedural, even punitive organizations that protect the public and may bring that sort of hard process to those that we regulate. But empathy does allow us to regulate with people, not to people. And it helps us navigate conflict with a lot of transparency. It helps us lead through legislative reform with compassion. And I do think it helps build a culture where accountability and kindness can coexist together. And so, taking you through a couple of organizations that I've been able to work with, and empathy has not been a reaction to the disruption in this instance or these instances. It's been the strategy that allows us to transform through it.
I always say that fear, a sense of forcefulness, and more of like an authoritarian type of leadership approach is the easy way out. And the reason why I say that is because it takes so much more skill and effort to take a tempered, aware, grounded, empathetic approach because a lot of what we're primed in terms of how to respond, especially when we've been under a tremendous amount of pressure and stress over long periods of time. And people leaders, they face that, the big problems, these epic problems. It can be a lot, and it can be a lot, especially over a long period of time. And that it could just be easier to become triggered or to take that reactionary response. And what I'm hearing from you is that empathy allows a little bit of that slowing down, allows the deep listening that is so needed right now for innovative thinking, builds that sense of trust which is needed to move through change, which is a very fearful process for so many people. And I think it also allows us to really develop that sense of transparency because we're creating a conversation. You're actually allowing there to be that co-creation of building awareness around what are the systems that we're engaged in right now? What are these processes? Okay, how can we take an eagle's eye view and understand them really clearly and see what we can work with? And it's really interesting when you think about, let's just say AI, which is a dominating topic right now, that I don't foresee that anytime in the near future where that type of context and that ability to see in that way will be able to be emulated in technology and in the immediate front. And something that I'm hearing as well is that I think now is one of these times of disruption. And by being able to bring a more empathetic stance, it's if anything, it's even more amplified the need for it so that we can be skillful during this time. And I think to be really careful of perhaps having that knee jerk reaction of let's just adopt this really quickly, let's bring forward change and transformation without considering the impact. And maybe just riffing off of that a little bit, what could be the impact? What could be the negative consequence from your perspective of perhaps bringing forward these AI transformations into organizations, specifically as it relates to the impact on the people and the impact on the organization at large?
Yeah. I think people will become disengaged. What I find sometimes is, I see my young children sometimes putting a question that they have for school into AI just to see what the response would be. And I have to remind them that go back to the textbook, read the story so that you could, as you mentioned, you could see the bird's eye view, you understand the system, you understand the context. And I think there is still very much an appreciation for understanding the bigger picture. And I think if we rely on AI too much, it sort of disengages folks from what it is that they're doing. It takes away from the innovation. It takes away from that sort of creativity, the growth mindset. And so, in a world where we're trying to encourage the growth mindset and transformation and being creative and finding purpose in your role and ensuring that you understand how your purpose here at the organization aligns to, let's say, our strategic plan. If we're going to rely so heavily on a machine, an application to just keep giving us the responses, I feel like that sense of ownership and creativity will sort of gnaw away at that overall engagement. And I do think that there will be that sort of disengaged atmosphere that will creep up. And so, for example, here we're taking a very slow approach to implementing AI on the inside and thinking about basic routine things, routine activities that we do re- that don't require that context or the innovation. Something like setting up a weekly team meeting or making sure that your calendar is optimized so that you've got small breaks in between meetings. Things like that that don't require context or creativity are, I think, great opportunities for an application like AI, but I wouldn't want it to take away from that inspirational joie de vivre, joie of why you come to work, that joy, the joy in work aspect. And that's, I think, what's really scary for me as a leader of the organization.
Hmm. I really resonate with that. Love to dive into being able to sort of see from an eagle's eye view, see the systems at play. And I know that you were introduced to the fifth discipline, which is Peter Senge's book, which talks about systems thinking and creating a learning organization. And so I want to dive into it, but maybe I could just share one unique example that I've heard recently from a media executive who was the CEO of Sprint in Canada. For those of you that are Canadian listeners, Sprint Mobile was a really large telecommunications company. But what was really unique, what he was saying is that if you think about a lot of these organizations that are automating so many of their processes and really thinking about efficiency, that it may pigeonhole their focus in a specific niche domain and maybe get really, really good at that. But the deep human element is be able to exist and to see these white spaces of where you can pivot and move, which is a very organic process. And so the downstream impact from not only just mindlessly going in and creating deep efficiency and automating as much as possible, approaching the work that way, which could provide great efficiency for the near term, by doing that, you may actually disrupt your workforce. So there may be many layoffs, there could be a lot of change and transition. And a byproduct of that, you might lose a lot of this incredible knowledge that you've invested in as an organization that comes from a deeply human experience of understanding, wisdom, work, collaboration, innovation, that when you need to pivot, you may not be able to move into these new spaces. which you're going to have to because change is an ongoing process. It's interesting. That's when I think about systems thinking and from a lens of sort of pulling back and seeing all the factors at play. That's the way I think about it. I'm interested from your perspective. How do you think about developing a learning organization? Because it seems like now that's needed more than ever. We need to learn and see things clearly and adopt things skillfully and not too quickly. This has been something that's been emerging in our conversation.
Yeah. I was introduced to Peter Senge's book, The Fifth Discipline, and Daniel Goleman's work on emotional intelligence very early in my career. They gave me this sort of language and a lens for the kind of leadership that I think I aspired to practice, one that integrates logic and empathy with systems and the soul. I'll just share a quick story. I vividly recall my first day as a director at North York General Hospital. I was invited to meet with the president and CEO at that time, Dr. Tim Rutledge, a tremendous, exceptional leader in the system. And his first question to me that day was, "What type of leader do you want to be? And what do you want to accomplish here at this organization?" And I froze. It was my first day back to work after maternity leave. And all I could think of was dropping off my two young boys at daycare and wanting them to be remembering me as a very good mom. And anyways, we had a great chat. We had a few laughs. And at the end of our time together, he gave me a gift, which was the book, was Peter Senge's book. And the fifth discipline introduced me to the idea of the learning organization, where people continually are allowed to expand their capacity and to create the results that they truly desire. The concept resonated with me deeply because it reframed leadership as a collective growth, not as an individual sort of phenomenon or as an individual hero. It taught me to see patterns, not silos. It taught me to understand that challenges rarely exist in isolation, but within the interconnected system that you're talking about, right? And whether in healthcare or regulation, that perspective has helped me to approach problems with curiosity rather than judgment. And it's only when you start understanding the system that you can actually stop blaming individuals and start improving the environment that they work in. And so at that same time, Goleman's work and his framework on emotional intelligence, such as self awareness and self regulation, motivation, empathy, all of that, social skills, these became a personal sort of compass for me. It reminded me that leadership effectiveness isn't about the technical expertise. It really is about that emotional mastery. And you can't go to an application for that, right? Like you can't have AI help you master that. It's having that ability to pause before you react, to listen to folks before making decisions, to adapt before resisting. These are all the hallmarks of sustainable influence. And over the years, I think I've learned that systems thinking without that sort of emotional intelligence piece, it becomes very mechanical, right? While having that emotional intelligence without systems thinking can become just sentimental. And I think the real magic happens at that intersection where empathy starts to fuel the insight, where the insight fuels the action. That's where that sort of transformation, I think, lives. And we talk a lot about today, all of my colleagues were all talking about AI. And it was funny, I was actually at an AI learning session a few weeks ago. And one of the concepts they thought they were teaching was you need to teach the AI chat box how you think. It needs to be able to think like you. And I thought, I want this thing to think like me. I want to think for myself. So again, reflecting on some of these frameworks that have been really pivotal in my leadership trajectory, they've become part of how I teach, how I lead, especially here at PEO. Because at the end of the day, it's not just about improving a process, right? That you can just put through a system or an application. Tell me how to make this better. What I'm trying to cultivate here is learning loops, feedback culture, reflective practice. And I encourage the teams that I work with every day to see every challenge as data, every interaction as a learning opportunity. Ultimately, leadership for me in this space today is a discipline. It's something that you practice daily. It's about bringing structure to compassion and compassion to structure, and evolving organizations one learning moment, one conversation, one act of awareness at a time, and just really being reflective across that process. And I'm not sure that these chat GPTs and perplexities and Claudes can do that for us, at least not today. And it would be sad to take that away from what people can bring to all of this sort of space.
What I really appreciate is it's almost like an engineering mindset to break down this commonly ambiguous set of leadership attributes and attributes like human attributes of how can we be aware, how can we engage in reflective listening, how can we continuously embrace that sense of self-awareness and that awareness of other people and the empathy on an ongoing basis, and it could feel overwhelming. But when you take it from the standpoint of like, okay, listen, let's just go on these basic building blocks, weave these types of qualities and attributes and skills in our day to day, then it's really comes up and shows up over time. And so I'm interested to explore how do we develop that? I'd love to explore a little bit around how it shows up for you. How do you sustain yourself throughout the day, and how do you continuously cultivate that ability to be aware and to be responsive rather than reactive? But before we do that, your insights there brought me to this one powerful quote by Martin Luther King, where he said that power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic. And it was really interesting as you were talking about systems thinking and taking a very analytical approach and sort of seeing the data that's out there it's very powerful and very empowering and very important. But then there's this deeply human ability to interpret that, to translate that to this human experience, and to build that sense of connection and that joy, and really understand what it means to exist as a human being in relationship with others, at work, doing passionate things, growing and moving forward. That being said, how does it show up in your day today? How do you sustain yourself so that you can model this with your teams and within your organization?
I love that quote. Hard to follow that quote. For me, it's really about bringing kindness into regulation. I know kindness and regulation might sound like an oxymoron, but actually it's the most powerful act of modernization a regulator can make. And that's been really important for me. And what has been driving me is how do we transform this culture, this system, the organization to elevate what it is that we're trying to do and frankly become relevant in today's society. For too long, I'll just speak about this, the space that I'm in now. Regulation has been perceived, as I mentioned before, very bureaucratic, very cold, very punitive. And this for me, was almost like a call to action, a challenge. How do I challenge this narrative by reframing kindness as a form of strength and not softness? And for me, that begins with intent. How do we become intentional about what we're doing? And so, kindness and regulation means for me remembering that every file, every complaint, every application represents a person, someone whose livelihood, reputation, or dream. Folks dream about becoming a licensed professional. Those dreams are affected by our decisions and how we make people feel through the process. And so, here at PEO, we've focused on embedding empathy into our processes, simplifying language in our communications, ensuring procedural fairness in every interaction, and training our staff to handle very difficult conversations with respect and compassion. You know, um, it, let's just talk a moment about transparency, which I also think is a hot topic in today's organizational dialogues. How do we become better at leading with transparency? For us, it might mean publishing data openly, clarifying, how we make decisions, communicating not just the what, but the how. Because I think if we take a step back, especially to the quote that you said earlier, it's when people understand reasoning, trust follows even when the outcome isn't in their favor. And internally, kindness has, I think, transformed how our teams collaborate. When something goes wrong, the question isn't, oh, whose fault is it, who failed, but really, what can we learn from this? And that mindset, because I come from a sort of a journey in healthcare, that mindset has been borrowed from the safety science and learning health systems that helps to build resilience and psychological safety, which I think are those sort of essential ingredients for excellence. Externally, again, driving that sort of kindness in regulation or kindness is shapes how we engage with government, with our engineers, with the public. We're really firm in upholding our standards, but we're also humble enough to listen and to evolve. And I think that balance of firmness and fairness is where, again, that sort of you can find where the trust lives. The reception, I think, if I look back over the last, especially 2.5 years, has been overwhelmingly positive. From, again, inside the organization, staff feel extremely proud to work for the organization because we hold ourselves accountable for leading with integrity and humanity. Our stakeholders now see us differently. They see us as more accessible and more responsive and more collaborative. And perhaps most importantly, it's changed the tone of regulation in Ontario, showing that you can do both rigorous and kind things at the same time, right? And discipline can be paired with empathy. And so for us, and for me in particular, so again, that driving piece is the kindness in regulation. I say that not as, a slogan or a catchphrase, but maybe I'm trying to start a movement, one that proves that accountability and compassion are not opposites, but partners in that public trust piece that we're trying to reinforce and to build.
And so, how do you develop that? Like, do you have specific programs? I know you've implemented a number of these initiatives to create an ongoing dialogue, and you're sharing your voice and articles to stimulate reflective awareness throughout the organization. But are there specific training initiatives about developing some of these skill sets and offering those for those who wish to develop, or to move through that leadership development path? Team opportunities for engaging in this learning? What are some of the elements that you do to
Yeah.
foster that skill set growth?
So I think it starts with leading by example and being a real role model for the values of the organization. So here at PEO, our values are professionalism, accountability, respect, teamwork, and integrity. And just showing up every day and living those values has been really important. But a lot of the I think the change as well has been through supporting our people through training. And so we just earlier this year launched what we call the PEO Academy, ensuring and actually doubling down on making sure that every single person here understands that we are invested in their success. And that means whether they stay with us or if they, learn those new skill sets and take them somewhere else. We're here because we're invested in continuing to see each and every single person develop as a leader. We also find the time to connect more together. And so, whether that's through divisional meetings, all staff meetings, retreats where we come together and we focus on, you know, building relationships or learning something new together, we are really intentional about finding those times where we can do things together and where everybody can see right from the top, from me and the senior leadership team enabling, participating, and actively wanting to, I think, show our vulnerability. Because even as leaders, as CEO, there's lots of things that I continue to work on, and doing that together, almost as a community, I think has really been at the forefront for how the change has been adapted, adopted, and embraced.
Mm. What are some of the offerings within the PEO Academy?
Lots. So we have leadership development that we're currently putting together. Folks can embark on certifications like their project management, their PMP. They can do Lean and Six Sigma training. They can do things like bite size micro learnings that are 15-minute little small webinars on everything and anything. I think there's over 400 courses in that we've put into the academy. And so you can learn from anywhere on any device on really any topic that you're interested in. That's what's in the academy for now. But what we also have in parallel to that is teams that can embark on training together. So, for example, a few weeks ago, we had our investigations team bring in an expert investigator that took them through a couple of days of training for their specific functional and technical area of expertise together, but really looking at again, taking a step back. Some folks want to learn on their own. Some folks want to learn together. Some want to develop new skills. Some want to hone in on the skills that they need for the work that they're doing today. Some for the work that they might want to do tomorrow. And so we want to allow that flexibility. And I think that's what has made it such a success.
There's in so many of the leaders that I connect with, the way that they show up is informed by their lived experience and the wisdom that they've acquired along the years, along the journey. And family plays a big role in that upbringing. And I know from yourself that your family and supporting it and the journey from being raised in an immigrant household, there's many opportunities to cultivate that sense of empathy. I know that's reflected for me too, in a very similar way. I was born to very young parents who are immigrants from Poland,
Wow.
and I spent a lot of time in Poland. So it's interesting to see how these experiences shape us. What have been some of the defining moments that shaped you into seeing the world this way and to lead in the way that you're leading?
Oh, no, that's a great question. For me, empathy really didn't come from a textbook. It, as you mentioned, it came from sort of these life experiences. And so, as you mentioned, I grew up in an Italian immigrant household where hard work and humility were part of our DNA. My father came to Canada from a small town in southern Italy with very little education, but an enormous sense of pride in his work. And while he was at work, my grandmother, who lived with us at the time, raised me. She was illiterate. And so, reflecting just back on his story, my father spent 4 decades working for Canadian Tire as a maintenance worker, often fixing things that others had given up on. And when I was young, he struggled, of course, with spelling and writing reports. And so every night he'd come home with his work orders and we would sit at the kitchen together and I would help him fill out his maintenance forms. And perhaps it was through his experience or learning how to fix things through his reports that inspired me to become an engineer. At the time I didn't realize it, I don't think, but I think that experience itself was formative. I learned that leadership from especially from him isn't about having the loudest voice. It's about helping others find their way or find their voice. And watching my father taught me that the dignity of work and the power of quiet leadership is leading by doing and not necessarily declaring. Later in life, again, going back to that empathy deepened for me through my family's connection to disability and health challenges. I've been with my husband now for, my goodness, 23 years. And he has two brothers, Marco and Carlo, who were born with learning disabilities, physical disabilities, and complex mental health conditions. And they're incredible men who have taught me so much about resilience and inclusion and grace. And my board work, just going outside of this organization, but the board work that I've done, especially with Holland Bloorview Kids, and supporting causes like Capes for Kids has been really personal for me because I've seen firsthand how opportunity and compassion can really change lives. And it's through these experiences that have grounded my belief that leadership has to be anchored in humanity. I started off with that in our earlier in our podcast here. Grounded in humanity. I say that again because when you understand struggle, whether it's learning a new language, navigating bias, or facing health barriers, you start to see the world differently. You start to lead differently. You learn to listen longer, judge slower, connect faster. These are sort of early lessons for me that were the foundation for, I think, who I am today as a leader. They remind me that empathy isn't a leadership competency. It's not something you learn in a textbook. It's a responsibility. And it's how we honor the people whose stories have shaped our own, I guess.
Oh, that's so lovely. Bringing in that, the family perspective and how your father's, the legacy that he's had and lives on through you and your leadership, and also all the people in our lives, the impact that they play and the experiences that we have, they can shape us in really unique ways. And I think what you're sharing too is empathy and compassion is a skill that we can develop and is so important from a leadership standpoint when we are leading people, when we are supporting people, and how we do that and how we can see them as living human beings and how we can best support them in whatever it is that they need. That comes across. People feel that. And I think these experiences that we have through board work, through being in the community, through opening ourselves up to the diversity of human experience, it helps us build that ability. And the incredible thing, too, is that research is showing that the more compassionate we are, we actually start engaging in brain networks that actually promote flourishing and resilience, greater resilience than getting really caught up in these storylines and narratives around ourselves when we actually start shifting that perspective to more of a thinking of others and how can I take care of them and how can I really understand the suffering or the experience that they're going through. That actually reorients us into a bit of a different way of seeing the world and interacting with the world and being a bit of a different leader. And I think you point that towards that in a very eloquent way and you embody it. And so I'm really grateful for you for sharing with us those stories and your journey. And when you think about emerging leaders or leaders who have been leading in very traditional ways who are listening to this podcast right now, what would you offer as a stepping stone, as a first step towards embracing a more empathetic, human centered type of leadership style?
I think every leader thinks about sort of a shift at some point. I don't know. I think early in my career, I perhaps had the sense that strong leadership meant having all the answers, being decisive, efficient, and composed all the time. And I took pride in my problem solving skills and my ability to get things done. But over time, especially for me, working in healthcare and later in regulation, I realized that the best outcomes didn't come from being the loudest thinker in the room. It came from creating spaces for others to think, if I can share that. Love learning about leadership. I read books all the time. I listen to podcasts. I take inspiration from other leaders, but nothing really prepares you, I think, for a role quite like the experience of being in one. Because, suddenly everything that you've learned is tested at all at once, or you're challenged by things you've never encountered before. And so as a leader, you figure out very quickly that perhaps I'll just say a directive leadership style is a lonely one. And, it's one way, and it makes achieving lasting, meaningful impact nearly impossible from my perspective. Directive leadership only takes you so far. You may achieve results, you may deliver outcomes, but it's not until you replace that directive leadership with human centered leadership that I think you realize how much more is possible. I've learned because I've had the privilege of watching and learning and reporting to human centered leaders. And, when you begin to understand that people don't follow titles, they follow leaders who see them. For me, it was a pivotal move in understanding what it meant to be a leader. And so since then, I've carried that with me into all of my roles. And I've I reflect on this often. My leadership has evolved from what used to be, I think, an environment where directive leadership used to be the thing. I'm not sure that's what is necessary to lead in today's environment. And I think we have to be more connective. Of course, we need to manage outcomes and achieve those KPIs, but we also have to inspire growth in our people to be able to realize those. And that transformation comes from within. And once you learn sort of how to lead yourself with empathy, I think you naturally begin to lead others with it as well.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And so as we come to the tail ends here of our episode, if anybody would wish to get in contact with you, learn more about PEO, how would they do that?
They can reach out to me on LinkedIn. They can send me an email. It's all through my LinkedIn. So welcome any of those messages. I'm happy to connect with folks. Send me questions, comments, share reflections with me, and I welcome that dialogue.
Fantastic. Well, we'll definitely add that into the description. So please do follow, connect with Jennifer. Her insights on LinkedIn are completely aligned to the way that she shows up here. And Jennifer, thank you so much. I think we've covered so much around how we can show up as leaders during this time of great disruption and change and transformation and balance the technical with the human side of things in a very pragmatic way, and how to introduce that across organizations, through this very reflective, empathetic listening stance that can really foster innovation, resilience, and trust and human connection. I think it's such important insights for us to really listen to and to understand. And so, thank you so much for sharing them.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And for all of you who've been listening, thank you as well for joining in. This has been another episode of Leading Minds Revealed. I look forward to seeing you at the next one.
Leading Minds Revealed podcast requires more than a conversation. It takes action, research, and collective wisdom. If today's episode resonated with you, we'd love to hear your insights, join the conversation, and help us shape the future together. We'll be back with more stories, strategies, and real-world solutions that are making a difference for everyone. In the meantime, be sure to subscribe, rate, write a review, and share it with someone you think would benefit from it too. Thanks for listening, and see you on the next episode.